Beyond Good and Evil by Friedrich Nietzsche. A sleepy summary. Settle in now, let your shoulders drop, let your breath slow down, and allow your mind to drift gently into the deep world of Friedrich Nietzsche's most ambitious and wide-ranging philosophical work. A book he wrote in 1886 that he considered a prelude to his philosophy of the future. A book full of fire and provocation, but which we will now explore in the softest, most soothing way imaginable, drifting from idea to idea like a leaf carried slowly downstream on a warm autumn evening. Nietzsche begins with a long, slow breath of a question. He asks us to consider something we rarely stop to think about. He asks us, what if the things we have always called truth are not really truth at all? What if the great philosophers who came before him, all those serious men sitting at their serious desks in their serious libraries, were not discovering truth so much as they were inventing it? What if their grand systems of thought, their elaborate architectures of logic and reason, were really just elaborate disguises for their own personal desires, their own unconscious drives, their own fears and hopes dressed up in the formal clothing of philosophy? This is the gentle but unsettling question Nietzsche places at the very beginning of the book, like a soft hand on your shoulder in a dark room, asking you to look more closely at what you thought you already understood. He invites us to think about Plato, that ancient Greek philosopher whose shadow falls over all of Western thought, whose idea that there exists a perfect, unchanging realm of pure forms or ideas beyond the messy world we actually live in, has quietly shaped how people in the West think about truth and morality and beauty for more than 2,000 years. Nietzsche looks at this legacy and asks whether Plato's philosophy was not really just Plato's temperament given a philosophical name. He suggests that what we often call objective truth is something much more personal, much more human, much more rooted in the body and the instincts and the particular circumstances of whoever happens to be doing the philosophizing at any given moment. On the prejudices of philosophers. Now let your eyes grow just a little heavier as Nietzsche warms to his subject, his voice becoming more insistent but still, in our retelling, warm and low like a fire burning down to embers late at night. He wants to examine what he calls the prejudices of philosophers. By prejudices, he does not mean the ordinary kind of bias we might try to correct for, the kind we are taught to notice and overcome. He means something deeper, something structural, something almost inescapable. He means the way that even the greatest thinkers begin from assumptions they never question, assumptions buried so deep in their thinking that they do not even appear as assumptions at all, but simply as the way things are. One of the biggest of these unexamined assumptions, Nietzsche says, is the assumption that truth is more valuable than untruth, that honesty is better than deception, that reality must always be preferred to illusion. Nietzsche does not simply accept this. He turns it over in his hands like a strange stone, examining it from different angles, wondering why we are so sure that truth deserves this privileged position. Could it be, he asks softly, that certain illusions are actually necessary for life? Could it be that some falsehoods are more life-enhancing than certain truths? Could it be that the will to truth, which philosophers have celebrated as the highest virtue, is itself a kind of prejudice, just the most respectable and well-disguised prejudice of all? He makes a distinction that will echo through the rest of the book. between what he calls master morality and slave morality, but we are not quite there yet. First, he wants to clear some ground. He wants to suggest that what we have called philosophy up until now has largely been a kind of unconscious autobiography, the philosopher writing their own psychological history in the language of universal truths. When a philosopher claims to have discovered the nature of reality or the foundation of ethics, Nietzsche hears something else, something personal, something driven by instinct and desire and the particular shape of that individual's inner life. This is not meant to be a cynical observation. It is meant to free us. If philosophy has always been personal, then perhaps we can do philosophy more honestly, more courageously, by admitting the personal element rather than pretending it does not exist. The free spirit. Breathe out slowly now. Let the room around you soften. Nietzsche is going to introduce us to one of his favorite characters, the figure he calls the free spirit. The free spirit is not simply someone who does as they please, not a hedonist or a libertine. The free spirit is something more demanding and more rare. The free spirit is someone who has managed to detach themselves from the comfortable certainties that most people need in order to function, who can live in uncertainty without being destroyed by it, who can question even the things they love most without falling apart. Nietzsche believes that most human beings are not free spirits. Most people need what he calls the herd instinct, the warm comfort of belonging to a group that shares the same values, the same beliefs, the same sense of what is good and bad and true and false. There is nothing contemptible about this need, Nietzsche says, but it is a need that must be recognized for what it is rather than dressed up as virtue or wisdom. The person who conforms to the values of their time and place because it is comfortable and safe is doing something very different from the person who adopts those same values after a genuine and painful process of questioning and testing. The first is simply sleeping. The second has at least tried to stay awake. The free spirit, Nietzsche imagines, is someone who has passed through many stages of belief and disbelief, who has tried on many philosophies the way you might try on many different coats, who has felt the cold when the coat did not fit, and who has gradually developed enough inner warmth to go without a coat at all for stretches of time. This is a demanding ideal. It is also a lonely one. The free spirit cannot simply settle down in the comfortable village of a shared moral system and stop asking questions. The free spirit is always further out, always further on, always a little ahead of where the roads are clearly marked. Nietzsche imagines future philosophers, philosophers of the future as he calls them, who will be these free spirits writ large, people with the courage and the strength to create new values rather than merely inheriting the values of the past. He speaks of them with something approaching tenderness, these as yet unborn thinkers who will not be bound by the categories and certainties that have governed thought up until now. And as you listen to him describe them, you might find yourself wondering if he is describing actual future philosophers, or if he is describing an ideal that he himself is reaching toward, a self-portrait drawn in the future tense. What is religious? Now Nietzsche turns his attention to religion, and here his voice carries something complicated, not simple scorn, but something more like a sorrowful fascination. He is particularly interested in Christianity, the religion that shaped the world he grew up in, and the world of the entire Western philosophical tradition he is working within. He does not dismiss Christianity with a wave of his hand. He spends a great deal of time looking at it, studying its psychology, asking what kind of human being it was designed by and what kind of human being it was designed for. His answer is characteristic. He suggests that Christianity in particular and religious asceticism in general arose from a specific kind of suffering. When people feel powerless in the external world, when they cannot change their circumstances, when the strong seem to always triumph over the weak, there is a psychological move available to the weak that Nietzsche finds both understandable and, in a certain light, brilliant in its ingenuity. The weak can revalue the entire playing field. They can declare that weakness is strength, that suffering is dignity, that powerlessness is virtue. They can declare that the proud and the strong are actually the wicked, while the humble and the meek are actually the righteous. In doing so, they do not change the external situation, but they completely reverse the internal valuation of it. This is what Nietzsche calls the slave revolt in morality. It happened, he thinks, primarily through Jewish and then Christian thought, and its effects have been so total and so thoroughgoing that we in the modern world have almost entirely forgotten that morality could ever have been any different. We think of humility and pity and selflessness as obviously virtuous, as if these qualities were written into the structure of reality itself. But Nietzsche asks us to imagine that once upon a time, in earlier human cultures, these values were not the highest ones. That what was once considered good was strength, vitality, pride, creative power, the affirmation of life. That what was once considered bad was simply weakness, not evil, not sinful, just weak and therefore not admirable. This earlier valuation is what Nietzsche calls master morality. It is the morality of those who are themselves the standard, who call good what they find in themselves and bad what they find lacking. The slave revolt replaced this with what he calls slave morality, a morality that begins from resentment toward the strong, that defines goodness not as something the good themselves embody, but as the negation of the enemy, as the opposite of what those wicked, powerful people over there are like. It is a reactive morality rather than a creative one. And Christianity, Nietzsche suggests, carried this slave morality to its ultimate philosophical expression. Let your breathing deepen a little more. None of this needs to agitate you. Think of it as Nietzsche gently unwrapping something that has been wrapped for a very long time, not to destroy what is inside, but simply to see what it actually is before deciding what to do with it. He is not saying that suffering is unimportant. He is not saying that the weak deserve no consideration. He is asking a more basic question about where our values come from and whether we have chosen them with open eyes or simply inherited them without thinking. Nobility and the aristocratic order. Here Nietzsche becomes more careful to read, because his language of aristocracy and hierarchy can sound, if you are not listening closely, like something it is not. He is not writing a political manifesto or advocating for any particular social arrangement. He is writing psychology. When he speaks of higher and lower human types, he is speaking about degrees of vitality, creativity, self-mastery, and the capacity to affirm life even in the face of its suffering. He is speaking about something internal, not about class or birth or the kind of accident that places one person in a palace and another in a hut. The aristocratic soul, as Nietzsche describes it, has a particular relationship to itself. It does not derive its sense of worth from comparisons with others. It does not need to be reassured that it is better than someone else in order to feel that it is good. It has, you might say, an inner standard rather than an external one. It gives rather than takes. It creates rather than merely preserves. And crucially, it says yes to life, yes to struggle, yes to suffering even, because it understands that the full experience of being human, including its difficulties and its darkness, is more valuable than any comfortable diminished version of life that might be achieved by avoiding pain. This is in contrast with what Nietzsche calls the herd, and again, the word sounds harsher than he means it. The herd is not despicable. The herd is simply the majority of people who are shaped primarily by the need for safety and conformity and the approval of those around them. There is something deeply human about this need, and Nietzsche knows it. But he believes that a civilization that elevates herd values to the highest position, that makes comfort and safety and egalitarianism into the supreme goods, will gradually lose something essential, something that has to do with the range and depth and creative ambition that human beings are capable of. He worries, writing in the late 19th century, that the modern world is drifting in exactly this direction. He sees in democracy and socialism, and the general leveling of social distinctions, not the triumphant march of human dignity, but a subtle impoverishment of human possibility. He worries that the man he calls the last man will emerge from this process, a contented, comfortable, small-souled creature who has made the avoidance of suffering into the whole of life's ambition, who blinks in mild puzzlement at the very idea of striving for something great, who has traded the difficult joy of creation for the easy pleasure of consumption. This is one of the most haunting visions in the book, and it settles on you slowly, like the first cool edge in the air that tells you summer is ending. The will to power. Sink just a little deeper now into wherever you are. Let the weight of your body feel fully supported. Nietzsche is going to tell us about what he considers the fundamental drive of all living things, and he calls it, in a phrase that has been much misunderstood, the will to power. It sounds alarming. It sounds like a philosophy of domination, of conquerors and conquered, of boots on throats and flags planted on fallen enemies. But Nietzsche means something much stranger and much richer than any of that. The will to power is not primarily a will to dominate other people. It is a will to self-overcoming. It is the drive that all living things have to grow, to expand, to discharge their strength, to become more of what they are. A tree pushing upward through the dark toward light is expressing will to power. A composer struggling to find the phrase that will make the music say what she hears in her head is expressing will to power. A philosopher who breaks apart his own most cherished beliefs because he has found something that does not fit is expressing will to power. Even the ascetic who disciplines himself toward greater and greater degrees of self-control is paradoxically expressing will to power, power over himself, power over his own drives and appetites. What Nietzsche is attacking is not the desire for power per se, but the specific forms that the desire for power takes when it is weak and resentful rather than strong and creative. The weak person who wants to diminish and control others because their own inner resources are insufficient to sustain a sense of worth. The moralist who wants to impose their values on others because they cannot bear that others might live differently. The priest who makes others feel guilty because guilt makes them manageable. These are all expressions of a debased and distorted will to power. Power that cannot express itself creatively and so expresses itself destructively instead. True power, Nietzsche suggests, is self-sufficient. It does not need to diminish others to feel itself. It does not need universal agreement to confirm its values. It creates rather than reacts. It gives rather than takes. And it is, ultimately, a kind of love, a love not of weakness and suffering, but of the whole of existence, of the world as it is in all its difficulty and beauty and strangeness. This is what he will later call, in other books, the Dionysian affirmation, saying yes to life not despite its suffering, but in full knowledge of it and beyond it, peoples and fatherlands. In one of the more discursive sections of the book, Nietzsche takes up the question of European culture and national character, and here he is at his most journalistic and observational, moving through impressions of different European peoples with the eye of a very intelligent and somewhat restless traveler who has spent too much time watching people in cafes and train stations. He has observations about the French, the Germans, the English, the Jews, the aristocratic classes of various nations, and about what he sees as the slow, difficult, not yet completed process by which Europe might be becoming something new, something that transcends the old national boundaries and petty nationalisms that he found deeply tiresome. He is famously and pointedly anti-nationalist. He despises German nationalism in particular with the kind of intensity that only comes from intimacy, from having been surrounded by it, from having watched people he otherwise respected succumb to it. He sees in nationalism a kind of intellectual cowardice, a retreat into collective identity that saves individuals from the difficult work of becoming genuinely themselves. The nationalist can feel significant and powerful not through any achievement of their own, but simply by identifying with the supposed greatness of their people, their race, their history. Nietzsche finds this contemptible in the same way he finds all forms of borrowed identity contemptible. What he hopes for instead, and you can hear in this section a kind of quiet longing underneath the sharpness of his observations, is the emergence of what he calls good Europeans, people who have outgrown the pettiness of national feeling without losing their cultural depth, people who can take the best of what their particular tradition offers while remaining open to what other traditions have to offer, people who are working, even if they do not know it, toward a new synthesis of European culture that will be richer and more vital than any of its current national manifestations. What is noble? Your breath is slow and steady now. The room is quiet. Let Nietzsche's final sustained meditation wash over you like the last movement of a symphony, slower and more resolved than what came before, gathering together the themes that have been sounding throughout the book and holding them in a single long, thoughtful chord. In the final part of the book, titled simply What is Noble, Nietzsche tries to describe in positive terms what he has been circling around all along. He has spent much of the book in critical mode, taking apart things, questioning foundations, exposing hidden motives, deflating pretensions. But the philosopher of the future, he is always clear, is not merely a destroyer. The philosopher of the future is primarily a creator, someone who brings new values into being rather than simply pointing out the inadequacy of the old ones. The noble type of person, as Nietzsche describes them, has several characteristics that he traces with care. They have what he calls pathos of distance, a natural sense of the difference between themselves and others, not an arrogant or contemptuous distance, but a genuine psychological space that allows them to see themselves clearly rather than being entirely absorbed into the social mirror. They are the kind of people who create values rather than receiving them, who ask what is good according to their own deepest nature rather than what is good according to what everyone around them thinks. They have a strong and secure relationship with their own instincts, a relationship that is neither simple indulgence nor tortured suppression, but something more like a conversation between equals. They practice what might be called a selective generosity, giving not from weakness or fear or the need to be liked, but from abundance, from an inner wealth that overflows naturally. They are capable of deep solitude without loneliness, capable of extended periods away from the social world without becoming strange or bitter, because they carry something within them that sustains them. They have what Nietzsche calls great health, not simply the absence of illness, but a positive and exuberant relationship to existence, the ability to taste the world fully and find it good even when it is hard. And they have, perhaps most importantly, a particular relationship to suffering. They do not seek suffering and they do not glorify it, but they do not flee from it either. They understand that suffering is a school, that the hardest experiences in a life can be the most formative, that a person who has never been tested has never really discovered who they are. This is not masochism. It is something more like the attitude of a sailor who respects the sea, who does not look for storms, but who does not pretend the sea is always calm, and who has learned to navigate because of how many times they were nearly swamped. The revaluation of all values. There is a phrase that hovers over this entire book and over all of Nietzsche's mature work, a phrase that he returns to again and again like a composer returning to a key theme, the revaluation of all values. It is a phrase that sounds radical and destructive, as if Nietzsche simply wants to tear everything down and replace reverence with nihilism, morality with chaos. But this is precisely the opposite of what he means. Nietzsche is deeply, urgently concerned with the problem of nihilism. He sees nihilism, the collapse of meaning, the loss of any basis for valuation, as the great danger facing the modern world. He announces, famously in other books but implicitly here, that God is dead, meaning not as a triumphant atheist but as a diagnostician, as someone naming a cultural fact that he finds enormously dangerous. If the Christian God was the foundation on which European morality rested, and if that foundation has been undermined by science and historical criticism and the general movement of modern thought, then the values that rested on that foundation are also in danger. The house is not yet falling, but the ground beneath it has been quietly washing away for centuries. The response to this situation that Nietzsche absolutely does not want is what might be called secular nihilism, simply continuing to act as if the old values were still in force, while their foundations quietly crumble, or alternatively, collapsing into the view that since nothing is absolutely grounded, nothing matters. Both of these he considers forms of cowardice, ways of avoiding the genuinely hard work that the situation demands. The genuinely hard work is what he calls the revaluation of all values. It means going back to the foundations, asking which of our values actually deserve to be values, asking which serve life and which diminish it, asking which arose from strength and creative affirmation, and which arose from weakness and resentment and the need to drag others down. It means being willing to discover that some things we have considered good are actually life-denying, and some things we have considered bad are actually life-affirming. It means being willing to start from scratch, not in the sense of becoming amoral, but in the sense of building a genuine morality from the ground up, one that knows its own foundations and can stand on them honestly. This is the work of the philosopher of the future. It is not a comfortable work. It is lonely and difficult, and it involves a kind of courage that most people would prefer not to exercise. But Nietzsche believes it is necessary. He believes that the alternative is the slow sleepwalking of a civilization that has lost its ground, but not yet realized it. A civilization of last men blinking in mild satisfaction. A civilization that has traded the full dangerous possibility of human existence for a kind of comfortable, well-heated, well-fed, perfectly forgettable safety, truth, and perspective. Let your mind drift just a little now, like a boat that has let go of its mooring and is moving gently on the current. Nietzsche has something important to say about the nature of truth itself, something that has become enormously influential in the philosophy and intellectual life of the century and a half since he wrote these words, and it can be understood, if you relax into it, as something almost comforting rather than threatening. He is a perspectivist. He believes that there is no view from nowhere, no position from which the whole of reality can be seen without any particular angle or interpretation. Every claim about truth is made from a particular perspective, with particular interests, particular instincts, particular limitations. This does not mean that all perspectives are equally valid or that there is no such thing as better and worse understanding of the world. It means that we should be honest about the perspectival nature of our knowledge rather than pretending to a godlike objectivity that no human being actually possesses. The honest thinker, on this view, acknowledges not just their conclusions, but the position from which those conclusions are drawn. They say not just this is what I believe to be true, but here is what shapes my believing. Here is the angle from which I am looking. Here is what I might be missing. This kind of epistemic humility, far from leading to relativism, actually leads to a richer and more nuanced engagement with reality, because it keeps one always aware that the map is not the territory, that the description is not the thing described, that truth is something we approach asymptotically rather than something we can ever simply arrive at and possess. There is something in this view that is actually quite peaceful if you let yourself feel it. It releases you from the terrible anxiety of having to be absolutely certain, from the impossible demand of seeing everything perfectly. It allows you to hold your beliefs with a kind of lightness, knowing that they are the best approximation you have been able to achieve so far, remaining open to the possibility that new experiences or new arguments might change them. Nietzsche is often read as a philosopher of intensity and will, but there is also in his work this quieter strand, this almost meditative awareness of the limits of knowing and the vast complexity of what there is to know. The philosopher and solitude. The philosopher for Nietzsche is not primarily a professor or a system builder or a public intellectual. The philosopher, in the deep sense he means, is someone who thinks from necessity, someone for whom thinking is not a profession or even a vocation, but simply what they cannot stop doing, the activity through which they most fully are what they are. This kind of philosopher requires solitude, not as a preference or a luxury, but as a basic condition of their work. Nietzsche is eloquent about solitude in this book, and throughout his writing, partly because he himself was profoundly solitary, a man with almost no permanent home and few lasting close relationships, wandering between boarding houses in Switzerland and Italy and France, often ill, often financially precarious, always writing. He does not romanticize solitude in a shallow way. He knows its cost. The lonely thinker misses the warmth and comfort of belonging. They miss the ordinary social pleasures that most people take for granted. They can become strange to themselves, too, spending too much time in the inner world and losing fluency in the outer one. But solitude also makes possible something that community cannot easily provide: the space to think thoughts that are genuinely one's own rather than variations on the shared thoughts of the group. When you are always in company, always accountable to the opinions of those around you, always shaped by the continuous low hum of social expectation, it becomes very difficult to think anything genuinely new. The genuinely new thought, the thought that departs from the settled roads and ventures into unmapped territory, requires the space that only solitude can fully provide. It requires the willingness to be alone with a thought long enough that it can develop into something more than a flash of intuition, something that has been tested against itself, examined from multiple angles, held up to the light of one's most honest inner looking. This is the kind of philosopher Nietzsche admires and aspires to be. Not the comfortable academic who builds an impressive system within the safe boundaries of established thought, but the solitary thinker who follows a thought wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere frightening, even when it leads somewhere that will make readers uncomfortable, even when it leads somewhere that Nietzsche himself cannot fully see. His books are full of this quality, of thoughts caught in mid-development, of insights that open onto further questions rather than closing on settled answers, of a mind that is genuinely in motion rather than simply decorating and elaborating positions it has already decided on. The affirmation of life. We are moving now toward the end of our journey through this difficult and beautiful book, and it feels right to spend a little time with what is perhaps the deepest and most personal note in Nietzsche's philosophy, the thing that underlies all the criticism and the provocation and the challenging of received ideas, the extraordinary affirmation at the heart of his thinking. Despite everything, despite the loss of God, despite the exposure of morality's human and all too human origins, despite the recognition that there is no cosmic comfort or ultimate justice waiting to reward the virtuous and punish the wicked, despite the full knowledge of human suffering and limitation and the inevitability of death, Nietzsche says yes. He says yes to life. He says yes to the world as it is rather than to any imagined world that might be better. He says yes to the eternal recurrence, his most extreme thought experiment, the idea of having to live exactly this life, with all its pain and joy and loss and glory, not once but infinitely many times, and finding that idea not terrifying but somehow exhilarating, somehow the ultimate test of whether one has truly made peace with existence. This affirmation is not naive. It is not the cheerfulness of someone who has not yet understood how hard life is. It is the affirmation of someone who has understood precisely how hard life is and chosen to love it anyway, chosen not despite its difficulty, but in some mysterious sense through its difficulty and because of it. It is the philosophical equivalent of what the ancient Greeks understood by the word amor fati, love of fate, not resignation to what is but genuine love of it, a love that is strong enough to want nothing different, to need nothing to be other than it is. This is what the noble soul, in Nietzsche's ideal, ultimately embodies. Not the warrior who triumphs over enemies, not the conqueror who bends others to his will, not the moralist who imposes values on the unwilling, but the person who has come into a deep and honest relationship with their own existence, who has faced the worst that life offers and found it not unbearable, but even, in some sense, that is very difficult to put into words, beautiful. Not beautiful because suffering is good, not beautiful in any way that diminishes or denies the reality of pain, but beautiful in the way that the whole of a complex and irreducible thing can be beautiful even when many of its parts are terrible. A gathering dusk. Now let the book close gently in your mind. Let the ideas settle like dust settling in a room after a long day, finding their places, growing still. Nietzsche wrote this book in the year following his completion of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, his great lyrical masterpiece, and he thought of it as a more sober and systematic companion to that work, a work of philosophy in a more recognizable form, building and arguing rather than singing and speaking in parables. In some ways that is what it is, but it also contains some of the most brilliant and personal aphorisms in the entire philosophical tradition, small concentrated paragraphs that hold more thought per line than most books hold per chapter. He wrote it during a period of relative physical stability for him, working in Sils Maria in the Swiss Alps, in the thin high air that he found clarifying, in the long summer light that sustained him. He was largely unknown at this point in his life, published but not widely read, celebrated by a tiny number of admirers, but ignored by the mainstream of European intellectual life. He wrote anyway, driven by that necessity he himself had described, by the sense that he had things to say that had not been said, and that needed to be said regardless of whether anyone was listening. The full recognition, the wild posthumous fame, the enormous influence on philosophy and literature and psychology and culture, all of that was still to come, and he did not live to see most of it. He collapsed in January of 1889 in Turin, apparently from a nervous breakdown from which he never recovered, spending the last 11 years of his life in a state of mental incapacity, cared for first by his mother and then by his sister. The irony of this ending, for a philosopher who had celebrated strength and vitality and the noble self-overcoming individual more than almost anyone, is almost too painful to contemplate, and we will not contemplate it long. What we will hold instead is the work itself, which has outlived the circumstances of its creation and the tragedy of its creator's end, which continues to provoke and disturb and illuminate 140 years after it was written, which continues to find readers who encounter it for the first time and feel, as many readers have felt, that someone is speaking directly to something they had felt but could not yet name. That someone is taking seriously the questions they have been afraid to take seriously. That someone is giving them permission, if they need permission, to think more honestly and more courageously than they might otherwise have dared. What remains? Beyond Good and Evil is, in the end, a book about what it means to take thinking seriously. It is about the courage that genuine thought requires, and the loneliness it imposes, and the freedom it can, at its best, produce. It is about the difference between the thinking we do to confirm what we already believe and the thinking we do when we genuinely do not yet know where we are going, when we follow a question honestly rather than leading it toward a predetermined destination. It is a book about values, about where they come from and what they are for, and which ones deserve the name and which are simply habits and fears dressed in philosophical clothing. It is a book about human greatness, about what the full expression of human possibility might look like if we were brave enough to stop hiding from it, if we were willing to accept the difficulty and the solitude that full expression requires along with the joy. It is a book written by a man who was, in many ways, describing himself, his own situation and his own aspirations and his own loneliness and his own impossible standard for what thinking could be. There is something deeply moving about this when you see it, about the philosopher as a particular kind of human being fully committed to a particular kind of life, not theorizing about what greatness might look like, but actually attempting it, one book at a time, one aphorism at a time, one question at a time. And now the stars are out, all the cold, brilliant stars above whatever landscape surrounds you, and the book is finished, and your eyes are heavy with the weight of all these ideas settling into you, not as conclusions but as seeds, not as answers but as questions you can carry gently forward into tomorrow and the day after and all the days that follow. Nietzsche would not want you to simply believe what he has told you. He would want you, if he wants anything from us at all, to use what he has told you as a starting point for your own most honest thinking, as one perspective among many that you have taken in and tested and responded to and ultimately made your own. That is perhaps the most Nietzschean thought with which to end. That the purpose of reading Nietzsche or reading any great philosopher is not to arrive at their conclusions, but to be sharpened by the encounter, to find your own thinking made more precise and more courageous and more honest by having pressed itself against something demanding and alive. To be, in that sense, just a little more of a free spirit than you were before you began. Close your eyes now. The book is done. The questions will still be there in the morning, patient as mountains, asking nothing of you tonight but sleep.